Hey, what's the difference between these two scenes that makes this one look better than this one? A little phenomenon called ambient occlusion. In the real world, light will bounce about a room, but it's going to have a harder time reaching small nooks and crannies on and between objects. This causes these areas to appear darker and is necessary if we want our objects to feel grounded. And looking with and then without, you can really see the difference is quite noticeable. But how do we get this? One way is artistically, by painting ambient occlusion maps that will get layered on top of our models, and they will define where that model should be darkened. But my art skills are non-existent, and the crevices between separate objects still lack ambient occlusion. The other way is to get maths and shaders involved, and the most common method for this is a little thing called screen space ambient occlusion. Before that though, looking at the scene I got set up in the engine, yeah, it's quite shit in it. There also ain't any places AO would occur, so this really is going to need changing. After nicking a bunch of terrain assets, I threw together this new scene that looks a bit more interesting. Great use of midnight motivation. For the sake of clarity, I'm gonna get rid of the shadows for the time being, just to remove any distractions. Hi, back on track. Let's figure out the theory. Let's take a group of randomly distributed points, what dickheads call a kernel. If we overlay the kernel's center on some geometry, we can see that these points will either end up inside the geometry or outside it. If we demo this elsewhere, you'll notice that more of these points end up inside when we're closer to crevices. And if we tally up the total number of points inside and put this over the total number of points in the kernel, we can guesstimate where and how strong AO should be applied. So this whole method boils down to cycling through each point within the kernel, checking if it's inside the geometry, and using this to get a fraction that will tell us how much the geometry should be occluded by. And with SSAO, this idea gets thrown into a post-processing shader that will take in that kernel alongside some extra buffers to give it info about our scene. It will then run on each pixel of our frame and calculate an AO map. This will get factored onto the main render, what I'll call the color buffer, to give us AO. Before moving on though, this kernel could use some work. First off, this whole sphere is unnecessary as half of it's always going to be in the geometry anyways. Let's half it into a hemisphere so we ain't wasting our time with pointless checks. However, we now need to know the surface is normal so that the kernel can be orientated correctly, but I'll talk about how we'll get this normal in a sec. That's the kernel sort, but what about these extra buffers I mentioned? When drawing our scene, we can also get the GPU to output these separate buffers alongside the main render. This allows us to output extra data about the scene such as per pixel normals, frag positions, etc, etc. These buffers then get sent to our post-processing parts to be used in crafting different effects. And with SSAO, we're going to need that normal and frag position buffer. The normal buffer is where we're going to get that surface normal for orientating the kernel, and the frag position buffer will tell us where that kernel should be positioned on the geometry. These buffers do have to be quite specific in that the values inside should be in view space, which is just regular world space but transformed so that the camera becomes the origin. An extra piece we should also include is this random noise map that will give us some vectors that we can use to offset the kernel's orientation, reducing any repetition. Alright, so that's all the data we need to know, and getting the engine doing all of this was thankfully rather straightforward for once. The issue now, I've actually got to make the shader. The shader starts simple enough, taking in all of that data. We'll sample the position, normal, and random vector of the current pixel from those buffers. This data is used to get this matrix that will orientate the kernel along the normal and convert it into view space. Before going through the kernel, let's define this tracker that will keep count of the total number of points ended up occluded. We're now set to cycle through each point, starting by using that matrix to do all of that transformation shit. We'll then throw on the frag position we got, placing the sample where the base pixel is in view space. We can now take this and project it onto the frag position buffer and get a new sample position. With these two positions, we can get their depth and run a depth test between them. If the depth of the new sample ends up closer, this indicates that the original sample is occluded. With that, we'll add on to our tracker. That's the algorithm sorted. Now all we gotta do is take that tracker and divide it by the total number of samples we ran, giving us the final AO result for that pixel. Throw this onto our AO buffer and repeat this for the rest of the thing and we get our map. Now all we gotta do is multiply this onto the color buffer, and there we have it. Hey, a good start, but I want to iron out a couple artifacts. First and most obvious, I don't think AO is supposed to be on these edges. Apparently this shit comes from our new sample position, as it can end up being really far away from the initial one. And even though the new one is closer, come on, it ain't occluding this. Fixing this only requires factoring a range check that will cut the occlusion if that distance is a little too large. The other fix I want to make is removing a lot of this unnecessary shit that's getting picked up on surfaces. And we can do this by calculating this angle weight that will get factored alongside the range check. With this all in place, yeah, that's much better. One extra thing to know about the AO buffer is it can end up having this grid artifact covering it, with a resolution to this being to just below the buffer. However, I'm actually going to leave this out, as at high enough resolutions, apparently you just can't see it. And that is that. It may not be the most obvious effect, but with the ability to toggle it on and off, you can really see the difference, and just how much more grounded things look. Anyways, that's all I got for now. This heat, man. Fuck this bum-ass country. I can get shit in the UK, man.